There's something just profoundly mysterious about what happens right when we die. Brain scan of a dying patient, the sort of broader neurology of death, how neuroimaging helps figure out brain death, and then the really intricate neurophysiology of those very last instants. It's what happens in the brain when we die. The whole unpredictable nature of death just makes it super difficult to uh, conduct detailed studies, gather consistent data.
Yeah, you can't exactly schedule it.
Right. So while we have these fascinating glimpses, it's not the full picture. Not yet, anyway.
That's a really crucial point to keep in mind. The variability, how and when death happens, means a lot of the research relies on careful observation, interpretation, often of pretty limited info.
But even with those limits.
But even then, yeah, there's some truly remarkable findings we can dig into together.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with something that feels like almost culturally universal.
Yeah.
The idea of your life flashing before your eyes.
Ah, yes, that one.
The article about that first ever brain scan, it touches on this. And it immediately made me think of some comments we saw from you all on Reddit. Someone described it as seeing highlights and lowlights.
Highlights and lowlights. That resonates, doesn't it?
It does, intuitively.
And that intuition, well, it kind of lines up with some of the science. For instance, the What Happens article talks about studies where NDE survivors, people who've had near-death experiences, report these incredibly vivid recollections.
All right.
And interestingly, those experiences were linked neurologically to increased alpha band activity in the brain.
Alpha waves. Okay, remind
Mhm.
me. That's a specific pattern of brain activity, like a frequency.
Exactly, precisely. Think of brainwaves like different radio frequencies.
Yeah.
Alpha is often linked to a state that's sort of relaxed but still aware.
Okay.
But it gets a bit more complex. Another study actually found that when people recalled their NDEs, their brain showed increased theta and delta oscillations.
Theta and delta, those are different.
Yeah, typically linked to deeper states, maybe sleep or deep meditation. And this was compared to when control subjects just recalled ordinary life memories. They showed more alpha and gamma.
So wait, the brain activity during recalled NDEs, it's different from just remembering a regular event?
It seems so, which is fascinating, right? It suggests it's not just a simple replay. It might involve a different kind of mental processing, maybe hinting at a unique state of consciousness right there at the edge.
Wow, okay. That Reddit comment describing it as infinite scrolling at 10x speed.
Huh. A very modern take.
Yeah. But then someone else made a really practical point, saying essentially, look, your brain doesn't have the storage for every single second, just the highlights and lowlights. Makes sense.
That's a very insightful point, actually. Our brains are selective. They have to be.
Right.
So the highlights and lowlights idea probably reflects, emotional weight, how often we replay certain memories. Now, digging deeper into the neurophysiology, that What Happens article also mentions gamma oscillations.
Gamma. Okay, another frequency.
Yep, high frequency, linked to cognition, memory, consciousness, lots of stuff. And early rodent studies. They showed these bursts of gamma waves in the neocortex after pretty drastic events like decapitation or induced ischemia.
Ischemia.
Yeah.
That's lack of blood flow, right?
Exactly. Lack of blood flow to the brain. And this finding led to this term, the wave of death.
Wave of death. Sounds pretty final.
It does. But here's where it gets really interesting. A landmark study, again in rats, where they induced cardiac arrest,
Okay.
they found an increase in these gamma oscillations across different brain regions before the EEG went flat, before the brain's electrical activity stopped completely.
An increase before it stopped.
Yes, and this gamma surge was also linked with more communication between gamma and those theta and alpha frequencies we mentioned. It suggests the possibility of some form of conscious processing happening incredibly close to the end.
So the brain might actually be, like, hyperactive in some ways in those final moments, not just shutting down.
That's a key takeaway, potentially. And it leads straight to a really fundamental question for all of us. When do we truly die?
Right.
The What Happens article notes that in some human cases, EEG activity, brain activity, has been seen to continue even after the ECG, the heart's electrical activity, has stopped. They even mention a case series where lack of activity in the frontal brain on the EEG sometimes happened before the heart and blood pressure dropped.
That seems backwards. You'd think the heart stopping is the definitive sign.
Traditionally, yes. But it seems the brain's activity doesn't necessarily just switch off the instant blood flow ceases. It looks more like a gradual process. Hmm. And interestingly, way back in 1969, the American Electroencephalographic Society suggested that 30 minutes of EEG silence was part of the criteria for brain death, again, pointing to this gradual fade out.
30 minutes?
Yeah. And furthermore, that same What Happens article mentions an older study that actually found three different types of EEG activity that could sometimes be seen after brain death was declared.
After. Like, even after doctors determined brain death.
Apparently so. Things like low voltage theta beta waves, activity that looked a bit like sleep patterns, even some alpha-like activity.
That is really surprising. So even after the clinical definition is met, there can still be something electrical happening.
It seems possible in some cases. And to add another layer, that article introduces this concept of end-of-life electrical surges, or ELEs.
ELEs.
Yeah, temporary bursts of brain activity seen in some, but definitely not all, dying patients. What they mean, why they happen, still big questions. Active research ongoing.
Okay, this is a lot to take in. Let's maybe switch focus slightly to near-death experiences, NDEs. You mentioned them earlier. The What Happens article explains they're often studied as like a window into the dying brain.
Exactly, a proxy, really, because as we said, it's incredibly hard to study people while they are actively dying, ethically and practically.
Yeah.
So NDEs reported by folks who came very close to death and were brought back offer these valuable, though, indirect insights. The AWARE study is a big one here, mentioned in the article.
What did AWARE find?
Well, it found that a significant chunk of cardiac arrest survivors actually reported having memories from that time. Some described classic NDEs, and a small few even recalled specific details of their own resuscitation.
So people reporting being aware when clinically their bodies weren't functioning, maybe even clinically dead.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The traditional view often writes NDEs off as, brain disturbances, lack of oxygen, or just psychological reactions to the threat.
Right, like hallucinations or something.
But what's so interesting, and what many report, is a feeling of heightened awareness, clearer attention, more intense consciousness during the NDE.
So the opposite of the brain just shutting down and getting confused.
Precisely. And the article highlights how NDE memories often have more characteristics, more detail, more self-reference, more emotion than even regular memories of real events or memories from being in a coma. Though they share similarities with real memories too.
More vivid than real life, almost.
In some ways, according to the reports, there's actually a tool they mention, the Grayson NDE scale.
Ah, table 1 in the article.
Right. It assesses the intensity based on things like a changed sense of time, thoughts speeding up, seeing a life review, feelings of peace, or that classic out-of-body experience.
Yeah, the out-of-body thing. That comes up a lot in NDE stories.
It does, and the article touches on this idea that NDEs might represent a state of disconnected consciousness, internal awareness continuing even when someone's unresponsive externally. But, and this is crucial, the article emphasizes that NDE findings are an imperfect proxy for understanding consciousness in the actually dying brain, especially when you consider brain death criteria involve irreversible damage.
So we have to be careful not to directly equate an NDE survivor's experience with what happens when someone doesn't come back, when brain death is declared.
Exactly correct. However, based on this NDE research, the article does float a pretty compelling possibility for us to think about. Maybe people in the dying process could experience a kind of hyper-awareness, hyper-attention, maybe enhanced consciousness, perhaps with vivid recall of important memories.
That is incredibly thought-provoking. Okay, let's shift gears again, maybe bring it back to the more clinical side. How does neuroimaging fit into actually determining brain death? You mentioned those other articles you shared.
Absolutely. Let's look at the role of neuroimaging and the neurology of death. Neurologists, as the neurology of death points out, are really central to understanding this transition from life to death. And neuroimaging gives them vital tools, especially for determining brain death.
And it's not like flipping a switch, right? This transition.
Not at all. That's a key point. The shift from having some basic brain activity to a state that meets brain death criteria isn't sudden. It unfolds over minutes, sometimes hours.
And the standard clinical exam, just checking reflexes and responses, that has its limits too.
It does. The clinical exam focuses heavily on the brainstem. Because of that focus, as the article mentions, you can sometimes still have some lingering electrical activity from the cortex, the outer brain layer, or even some very basic blood flow inside the skull, even after someone meets the clinical criteria for brain death.
Really?
Yeah, they even cite a specific case where organ procurement was actually stopped because the patient showed spinal reflexes and faint signs of blood flow in the head on imaging, even though the brain death protocol had been followed correctly.
Wow, so the body can show some residual activity even if the brain function needed for consciousness is gone.
That seems to be the case sometimes. And as the article also notes, because the brainstem can sometimes maintain a degree of blood pressure on its own, you don't always need blood pressure support medication for a brain death declaration, which again might explain why some minimal blood flow could still be detected.
Okay, so this is where those extra tests, the scans, become really critical.
Exactly. The role of neuroimaging goes into detail about how things like EEG, CTA, that's a CT scan looking at blood vessels,
Right.
CTP, which looks at blood flow perfusion, MRI scans, and radionuclide scans, are used as ancillary tests to confirm brain death.
What are they looking for, basically?
Primarily, they're looking for the absence of intracranial blood flow and/or the absence of brain electrical activity. So CTA and CTP check if contrast dye fills the brain's blood vessels. If it doesn't, that indicates no flow. A regular CT scan, SCTT, might show the loss of distinction between gray and white matter, a sign of severe damage. MRI uses special sequences to look for irreversible injury. And those radionuclide scans use tracers. If the tracer doesn't enter the brain, you get what they call a hollow skull sign. No perfusion.
So these scans provide more objective proof that brain function has completely and irreversibly stopped.
That's the goal, yes. But the neurology of death also reminds us that the specific laws and protocols for determining brain death actually vary quite a bit around the world.
Ah, so it's not globally standardized.
Not entirely, which adds complexity. That article also briefly touches on donation after circulatory death, DCD. That's organ donation after the heart has stopped beating, rather than after brain death is declared.
Right.
And this raises ongoing questions, especially about the hands-off period, how long doctors should wait after the heart snicks before starting organ recovery. There isn't universal agreement.
Seems like there's still quite a few gray areas and ongoing discussions in this field.
Oh, absolutely. It's constantly evolving. Interestingly, the neurology of death also mentions some potential biological explanations proposed for NDEs.
Yeah. Like what?
Things like dysfunction in a brain area called the temporoparietal cortex,
Yeah.
maybe issues with NMDA receptors, links to migraine aura, or even REM sleep intruding into wakefulness.
Hmm.
And they even float this really fascinating idea, could thanatosis, when animals feign death,
Play dead.
could that be an evolutionary ancestor somehow of NDEs? It's quite speculative, but interesting.
Definitely food for thought.
The article really concludes by saying that the boundaries in the neurology of death, understanding the dying brain, they're constantly being pushed, just like in every other area of clinical neuroscience.
Okay, so if we try to wrap this all up for everyone listening,
Yeah.
it seems pretty clear that what happens in the brain during our final moments is way more complex than just flicking off a switch.
Definitely not a simple shutdown.
We've talked about this intriguing possibility of a life review, maybe backed by real neurological activity surges. We've looked at the complex, kind of debated nature of consciousness near death, hinted at by NDEs.
Right, the hyper-awareness idea.
And then the crucial clinical side, the tools and methods used to understand and ultimately define the end of life medically.
Precisely. And maybe this leads to one final thought, something for you to ponder. Given this emerging evidence, this possibility of continued, maybe even heightened brain activity after the heart stops, or perhaps in the very early stages of dying.
Yeah.
What are the ethical implications? How might this change our understanding of the exact moment of death? And could that influence medical practices like resuscitation efforts or palliative care, or even how we approach organ donation?
That is a really powerful question to leave people with. It feels like while death itself remains this profound, deeply personal mystery, science is steadily uncovering more about the incredible neurophysiological events of our final moments.
It is. Progress is being made.
And hopefully, for everyone listening, your curiosity in exploring these complex topics feels like a valuable part of that ongoing journey.